This is my true story. I built my business with my bare hands so that my son would never have to struggle the way I did. I thought when I grew old and weak, he would stand by my side, proud of the man who raised him. But instead, he saw me as a burden, a chair on wheels that slowed him down. The day I found out he sold my wheelchair online, I didn't cry. I made a promise to myself. I'd make him see what real power looks like. Before I tell you how, tell me where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe so my story reaches more people. For most of my life, everything I did was for my son. From the day he was born, I made a silent promise that he would never go hungry, never feel the weight of poverty, never know the kind of struggle that shaped me. I started small, running a repair shop out of an old garage. Every penny I earned went into building something lasting, a business, a future, a name my son could inherit with pride. I wanted him to have everything I didn't. I worked through storms, through sickness, through nights when my back ached so badly I could barely stand, but every ache was worth it when I thought of the man he would become. When he turned 18, I handed him his first car, paid in full. When he graduated, I expanded the business in his name. I thought this was what a father's success looked like, to see your child stand taller than you, built on the foundation of your sacrifices. As the years passed, the company grew from a small family business into a respected name. People would shake my hand and say, "You must be proud." And I was. My son was sharp, charming, confident, everything I hoped for. I thought all the hard years had finally paid off. But what I didn't see then was how privilege, when given too easily, turns into entitlement. He didn't want to honor what I built. He wanted to own it, without the man who built it. Then came the stroke. One morning, my body betrayed me. My hands trembled, my legs weakened, and the doctor told me I'd need a wheelchair to move for a while. It felt like the world had stopped turning. I had spent a lifetime being strong, and suddenly I had to depend on others, especially him. I thought he would help me the way I once carried him as a child, but I was wrong. At first, he was kind, or maybe just pretending. He handled my meetings, took control of the finances, and assured me that everything was under control. I believed him. I thought I was lucky to have a son who understood responsibility. But soon, I began to see the change. The visits grew shorter, the conversations colder. The look in his eyes changed from love to irritation. He saw the wheelchair, not the man. I became a piece of furniture in my own home, rolled from one corner to another, left alone with the sound of ticking clocks and distant laughter. My son was too busy running the company to remember the man who built it. Still, I stayed silent. Love, I thought, must have patience. But love without respect is like a wheel without motion. It goes nowhere. I tried to remind myself of who he once was, the boy who used to ride on my shoulders, the one who called me his hero. I told myself it was just stress, that maybe the burden of business was too heavy on his young shoulders. But deep down, I knew it wasn't stress. It was greed. Then, one evening, as I sat in the corner of my room, I heard him talking to a friend on the phone. He spoke about selling some old junk online to make quick cash. I thought nothing of it until the next day, when I couldn't find my wheelchair. At first, I thought maybe he'd sent it for repairs. But when I asked, he just shrugged and said, "We'll get you another one." His tone was sharp, dismissive, cold. That night, I felt something break inside me. Not just my trust, my heart. A few days later, I would discover what he'd done. I would see the online listing. I would see the photographs. I would read the mocking words he wrote to sell it. But in that moment, sitting helplessly in a chair that wasn't mine, I realized something deeper. My son didn't just sell my wheelchair. He sold the last piece of respect he ever had for me. And that was the moment I stopped being his father and started being his lesson. It started with small things, the kind of moments most parents would overlook. My son stopped asking how I was feeling, stopped sitting beside me during breakfast, stopped talking about the company as if it still had my name on it. At first, I thought he was just busy, but over time, I realized it wasn't busyness. It was avoidance. Every visit grew shorter, every conversation colder. When my health declined, he began to take control of everything. He moved my name from documents, told employees to report to him directly, and quietly replaced me as the public face of the company. He called it streamlining, but it was really erasing. My signature, the one that built our business from nothing, was disappearing from my own legacy. I noticed my personal things missing from the office first. The old family photo that sat on my desk for 30 years vanished one day. Then the leather chair I used for meetings was replaced. Even my parking spot had a new nameplate. Every trace of me was being cleaned out, one quiet decision at a time. But what hurt more than the loss of things was the change in tone. My son spoke to me like a child would speak to an old neighbor, polite but detached. He didn't ask, "Dad, how's your leg today?" He said, "You should hire someone to take care of you." When I offered advice, he smiled like it was noise. When I mentioned the business, he sighed like it was history. Soon, he began handling my accounts too. I'd hear phone calls from his office, long conversations about transfers, liquidation, and debt coverage. He said it was for the company's benefit, and I believed him. After all, I trusted him more than anyone in the world. I was proud that he had become confident enough to lead. I thought he was protecting my interests, but behind that confidence, he was using my trust as currency. One afternoon, I asked where my savings statements were. He brushed it off, saying, "It's all digital now, Dad. I've got it under control." That phrase, "under control," would come to define his deception. Every time I asked a question, that was the answer. Every time I grew suspicious, he'd remind me that he was the responsible one now. And like a fool, I believed him. Months passed. My independence shrank. I relied on him not just for money, but for movement. The wheelchair became my lifeline, my only way to feel the world beyond the window. He knew it too. And instead of protecting that, he turned it into profit. One morning, I woke up and found my wheelchair gone. I thought maybe one of the house staff had moved it, but when I asked around, no one knew anything. My son was away on a business trip, and I had to use an old wooden chair with wheels just to move from one room to another. My dignity felt smaller than that chair. 2 days later, I saw the truth. While browsing online with the help of my caretaker, I stumbled upon a listing on a local marketplace website. A wheelchair, my wheelchair, was listed for sale. Same model, same custom cushion, even the same scratch near the handle where I had accidentally hit a wall months ago. The seller's name caught my breath, my son's email. The description below mocked the buyer, calling it used, but still good enough for the old. My heart didn't just ache, it shattered. He didn't just sell my chair. He sold the symbol of my survival. The very thing that gave me mobility, that gave me dignity, was turned into a piece of junk for profit. I stared at that listing for hours, unable to move, not because my legs were weak, but because betrayal had paralyzed my spirit more than any illness could. That was the first time I saw my son not as my child, but as a stranger. And that night, for the first time in my life, I didn't cry from weakness. I sat still and let silence become my armor. Because I realized something powerful. If my own son could sell my wheelchair to stand taller, then I would show him how a man with no legs could still make him fall. I wasn't going to fight him in the house he controlled. I was going to fight him in the one place he never expected, the boardroom. The discovery of that online listing burned into my memory like fire on paper. I stared at the screen, unable to believe that the wheelchair I once used to visit the office, to sign paychecks, to live my life with dignity, was now being sold by my own son. It wasn't the price that hurt. It was the words he wrote beneath it. The listing said, "Used, but still moves fine. Belonged to an old man who doesn't need it anymore." Those words didn't just mock my body, they buried my soul. I remember gripping the edge of the table so tightly my fingers went numb. My caretaker, An old friend named Henry stood behind me, speechless. He didn't need to say a word. I could see the pity in his eyes, and pity was the last thing I wanted. I wanted anger, justice, something to pull me out of that silent humiliation. But all I felt was a strange stillness, the kind that comes right before a storm. That night, as I lay in bed, I stared at the ceiling for hours. Every sound in the house, the ticking clock, the wind brushing against the windows, echoed with the weight of betrayal. I thought of every night I'd stayed late at work to ensure his comfort, every loan I'd repaid to keep his dreams alive, every word of advice I'd spoken that now meant nothing. The betrayal wasn't in what he sold, it was in what he didn't value. He didn't sell a chair. He sold a lifetime of loyalty, a father's trust, a bond built over decades. To him, it was just another object taking up space. To me, it was the symbol of survival, the very thing that allowed me to keep living with some measure of independence. I still remember the day I bought that wheelchair. The doctor had said I'd never walk the same way again after my stroke. It was the darkest day of my life, but when I sat in that chair for the first time, I felt something different. Hope. It wasn't defeat. It was adaptation. That chair was freedom on four wheels. It was how I attended board meetings, visited friends, and rolled through every storm life threw at me. And now, my own son had stripped that freedom away for a few $100s and a smirk. I tried to tell myself it was a mistake, that maybe he didn't mean it, that maybe someone else listed it. But the proof was right there. His name, his contact number, his carelessness. It wasn't an accident. It was an insult, one he thought I'd never find out about. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, watching headlights move across the dark street. I thought about every father who gives and gives until there's nothing left. I thought about every son who takes, believing that gratitude is optional. I thought about what it means to be a man stripped of power, not by fate, but by family. In that quiet, I realized something powerful. I didn't need my legs to stand tall again. I needed my mind, and that was one thing he hadn't sold. So I decided I wouldn't confront him. I wouldn't yell or cry or beg, because people like him, people who see love as weakness, feed on reactions. I would do something he'd never expect from an old, broken man. I would make him see that the one he called useless was the one who gave him everything he stood on. The next morning, I asked Henry to help me get dressed. I put on my best suit, the same one I wore when I opened my first office decades ago. It didn't fit perfectly anymore, but that wasn't the point. It was armor. While Henry wheeled me to the table, I looked at the empty space where my old chair used to stand and said quietly to myself, "He sold my chair. I'll take his company." That was the first morning in a long time that I felt alive. I didn't drink tea that day. I didn't eat breakfast. I just sat there, staring at the morning light breaking through the window, planning every step of what would come next. The humiliation had ended, and the reckoning was about to begin. That's when I made the first call, not to my son, but to my lawyer. That night, the house was silent. The kind of silence that doesn't comfort. It presses on the chest like a weight. I sat in the dim light of my study, surrounded by shadows and memories. The wheelchair he hadn't sold, the replacement one Henry found for me, creaked softly as I moved. On the desk before me sat piles of old ledgers, contracts, photos of the company I built from scratch. Each page reminded me of a lifetime of work now stained by betrayal. The clock struck midnight, but I didn't close my eyes. Sleep wasn't coming. My mind replayed the moment I saw that cruel listing over and over. The words, "old man who doesn't need it anymore," echoed like a curse. I realized then that the son I'd raised to be strong had mistaken compassion for weakness. He thought my age made me helpless. He thought a man who couldn't stand couldn't fight. But that night, something inside me shifted. I wasn't weak. I was just done being silent. I turned on the small lamp beside me and looked around the room, at the walls I had painted, at the trophies I'd earned, at the photo of my late wife smiling from the shelf. I remembered her words before she passed. Don't ever let what you built fall into the wrong hands. I had failed her. I had let greed wear my son's face and call itself family, but I still had time to set it right. That was the night I made my choice, not to beg, not to reason, but to act. I opened the cabinet drawer where I kept the company's old legal documents, ownership deeds, registration forms, and bank papers that bore my signature. I flipped through every file, checking what was still under my name and what had quietly been transferred. What I found made my stomach twist, a web of authorizations, all signed by him, all claiming my verbal consent. The arrogance was stunning. He had taken control of the business while I was in recovery, using my trust as the key. I realized then that my silence had made me invisible, so I decided to use that invisibility to my advantage. If he thought I was too old to notice, then I'd become the ghost he never saw coming. I'd make him feel what it's like to lose everything, not through yelling or fighting, but through the same quiet paperwork he used to betray me. I called Henry into the room. His face was pale, but his eyes told me he understood. He didn't ask why. He just nodded when I told him to find my lawyer's number. Within minutes, the call was made. My lawyer, an old friend named Marcus, agreed to meet me first thing in the morning. I told him only one sentence before hanging up. I'm done being the victim. After the call, I sat alone again, but this time, the silence felt different. It wasn't heavy anymore. It was sharp, focused. I could almost feel my wife's presence in that room, as if she was watching over me, whispering that this was the moment I was meant to rise. I looked out the window and saw the street lights glowing faintly against the night. My reflection stared back, older, slower, but not broken. My body might have been trapped in a chair, but my mind was moving faster than ever. That's when I realized something powerful. You don't need legs to stand up. You just need a reason. And my reason was clear. He had taken everything. My company, my dignity, my independence. But what he didn't know was that everything he touched still had my name buried beneath it. Every contract, every lease, every patent. And I still had the right, the legal right, to take it all back. I stayed awake until dawn, reviewing documents, drafting notes, piecing together a plan that would undo years of deceit. When the first light of morning touched the curtains, I wasn't tired. I was alive. The humiliation he gave me had turned into fuel. I didn't want revenge for comfort. I wanted it for closure. He had sold my wheelchair thinking I couldn't move, but now I was rolling straight toward the one thing he'd never expect, his downfall. When the sun finally rose, I smiled for the first time in months, because now I wasn't the man who had been betrayed. I was the man who had decided that justice was worth waiting for. That morning, I sat in silence, staring at the empty space where my wheelchair used to be. The betrayal burned deeper than the pain in my legs. My son hadn't just sold a chair, he'd sold the last piece of dignity I trusted him with. But I wasn't going to shout or beg. I was done being pitied. Through my lawyer, I started tracing every business record my son handled. It didn't take long to find the truth. He was drowning in debt. Investors were backing away, suppliers were threatening lawsuits, and employees hadn't been paid in months. He'd been living off my name, the same name he'd laughed at when he thought I was too old to matter. I opened the same folders he once used to control the company. Invoices, property deeds, share documents. What he didn't know was that most of it still carried my signature. My authority had never been fully transferred. He'd been too careless to check the fine print. That mistake became my weapon. I set up a private trust through my lawyer, a silent shell company with no trace of my identity. Every purchase, every transaction went through that trust. Piece by piece, I began buying back my own empire, the factories, the warehouses, the offices. I moved quietly, buying through third parties and forgotten partners. He never suspected a thing. While he flaunted cars and vacations, I met bankers in quiet rooms. While he mocked me for being stuck in a chair, I was signing papers that put him in one, a corporate one, built from arrogance and ignorance. By the end of the third week, the plan was ready. The trust I created now owned the majority of his company. On paper, it looked like an anonymous investor stepping in to save him. In reality, it was me, the man he had tried to roll out of his own life. I didn't feel angry anymore, just steady. The kind of calm that comes when a storm is over and you realize you've survived. He sold my wheels for cash. I was about to roll into his boardroom as his new boss. It happened on a Monday morning, the kind of morning when life pretends to be ordinary before it tears open the truth. My son arrived at his company in a crisp suit, walking with the arrogance of a man who thought he owned the sun. Cameras were already parked outside, reporters crowding the gate with microphones. He believed they were there to interview him for some expansion deal he had announced weeks earlier. He smiled, waved, and adjusted his tie. He had no idea the lights weren't there to celebrate him. They were there to expose him. Inside the lobby, the company logo gleamed on the wall, but the plaque beneath it no longer carried his name. It had been replaced 2 days earlier. The new plate read, "A division of TR Holdings." He didn't even notice. He was too busy preparing his speech, reciting empty words about legacy and innovation. His secretary, pale and nervous, tried to whisper something to him, but he brushed her off like dust. Arrogance makes a man deaf. At exactly 10 a.m., the doors to the main conference room opened, and the journalists filed in. Flashbulbs flickered. The press expected a statement about new leadership, but they didn't expect to see who was about to enter through the back door. The silence that fell when I rolled in could have stopped clocks. The cameras turned, one by one, capturing the moment the dead old man returned to his throne. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. My lawyer placed a single brown folder on the table. Inside were the final transfer documents proving my ownership of the company. Every seal was valid, every signature verified. My son's face went white as the papers slid across the polished glass. His smile died first. His hands trembled next. The photographers didn't stop flashing. They smelled a story that would fill front pages. He stammered, tried to object, but the board members already knew the truth. The shares he'd mismanaged, the debts he'd ignored, the fraudulent accounts he'd opened, all of it had been quietly audited under my direction. I had spent months cleaning the wreckage he created, turning his downfall into my redemption. My silence had been his biggest mistake. He mistook quiet for weakness. The head of the board stood up and read the statement I'd written the night before. As of today, the majority ownership and executive control of this company returned to its founder, Mr. Thomas Reed. My name, my company, my justice. The reporters surged forward, shouting questions that blurred into a single echo of disbelief. Is it true you were declared unfit to manage? Did your son know you were alive? How does it feel to reclaim your legacy? I didn't answer any of them. I just raised my hand slightly, not to silence them, but to steady myself against the weight of the moment. My son stood frozen, lips moving, but no sound coming out. He looked at me the way a drowning man looks at the surface, close enough to touch, too far to reach. The same man who sold my wheelchair online now stood powerless before a father who had rebuilt himself without standing up. Every reporter saw it. Every flash of light turned his arrogance into evidence. The humiliation was public, but my revenge was private. I didn't come there to destroy him, only to end the illusion he'd built on my name. When I turned my wheelchair toward the exit, the cameras followed, but I didn't look back. The applause didn't belong to me. It belonged to justice finally showing its face. Outside, the reporters surrounded me. I stopped for one photo, not because I wanted fame, but because I wanted proof that truth always finds its way home. That photo would run the next day across newspapers and online headlines under the title, "He sold his father's wheelchair. His father bought his company." I went home that afternoon, not victorious, but calm. For years, my son had buried me beneath his greed. That day, I rolled out of the grave he built, with nothing but my will, my paperwork, and the truth. I made myself a cup of tea, lifted it carefully, and smiled. The tea was warm, strong, and clean, just like justice when you let it steep long enough. The morning after the news broke, the world had already chosen its sides. My phone, quiet for years, wouldn't stop ringing, not from family, but from journalists, former employees, and strangers who'd seen the headline. My son's empire had become a national story, a lesson about greed and humiliation. Every outlet replayed the same footage, his stunned face as I rolled into the room. For once, I didn't turn off the television. I let it play. Each replay wasn't revenge, it was closure, carved into the public record. Within 48 hours, the board had called an emergency meeting. I didn't attend. I didn't need to. The decision was unanimous. His resignation, effective immediately. He tried to plead, to blame stress, to talk about forgiveness. But the same men who once nodded to him with fake respect now looked through him. No one wants to shake hands with disgrace. His office was emptied before noon. His name stripped from every letterhead, every glass door, every email signature. He lost everything faster than he gained it. The house he bought through company funds was reclaimed. The car, seized. Even the watch he'd once flashed in interviews was returned to the leasing company. What money couldn't teach him, shame would. The same people who once laughed at his arrogance now spoke of how the father never said a word. Silence had finally become the loudest voice in the room. Meanwhile, I went about my days quietly. My lawyer handled the storm. I focused on small, peaceful things, the warmth of sunlight through the window, the gentle hum of the kettle, the steady rhythm of my breathing. It was strange, how peace could come from something so public. For years, I thought revenge required rage, but it turned out revenge was just truth, finally finding its audience. A week later, my son appeared on television again, this time not as a businessman, but as a disgraced figure giving an apology that no one believed. His words were scripted, his eyes hollow. The reporters didn't buy it, and neither did I. Regret is a poor apology when it only comes after exposure. I didn't hate him. Hate means you still care. I simply felt distance, the kind that only truth can build. The father he buried beneath greed had resurfaced, not for vengeance, but for dignity. And that dignity, once reclaimed, doesn't return to silence. The last time I saw him, months later, he stood across the street as I left the courthouse after signing my final documents. He didn't call out, neither did I. Between us stood everything he'd lost: trust, respect, a name that once meant pride. He turned away first, and that was enough. Now, when I look at the framed newspaper on my wall, the one with the headline, "The Father Who Bought His Son's Company," I don't smile. I just nod. Not out of triumph, but gratitude. Life had given me a chance to reclaim my story, and I did, not by shouting, but by signing. The world eventually moved on, as it always does, but in that quiet home, sitting beside my new chair, I understood something simple. Revenge fades, but justice stays written. After everything settled, the world quieted in ways I had forgotten it could. The noise of lawyers, the sting of betrayal, even the echo of my son's downfall. All of it drifted into the distance, like a storm that had finally passed. I moved away from the city, to a small house on the edge of a sleepy town where people smiled when they passed you on the road. No one here knew my story. To them, I was just an old man in a wheelchair who liked to feed the birds and drink tea by the window, and that was exactly how I wanted it. Every morning began with the same peace I'd spent years chasing. The air smelled clean, untouched by greed or gossip. I'd roll out to my small porch with a cup of tea and watch the sun spill over the trees, turning the leaves gold. My hands trembled sometimes, but not from anger, from gratitude. I'd survived humiliation, cruelty, and betrayal, and yet I was still here, whole, dignified, free. I started writing again, small thoughts on scraps of paper, not about revenge, but about resilience. I wrote about what happens when people forget kindness, when greed replaces love, when silence becomes strength. Sometimes neighbors stopped by with muffins or small talk. None of them asked about the wheelchair, the company, or the headlines that once carried my name. They just saw a man who smiled easily, and that was enough. The money I had regained didn't matter anymore. I used most of it to fund small charities, schools, retirement homes, community gardens. It felt right. My wealth had once built arrogance in another man. Now it built peace for strangers. That was the only kind of legacy worth leaving behind. At night, I'd sit under a single lamp, the air thick with quiet. The house didn't echo like the mansion I once lived in. It breathed. Every creak, every sigh of the wind through the windows felt like a reminder that life, even after heartbreak, can begin again. I'd make my tea the way I always had, strong, simple, untainted. And every sip reminded me that dignity, once reclaimed, is the sweetest flavor of all. Sometimes I'd think about my son, not with bitterness, but with acceptance. Maybe one day he'd understand that betrayal doesn't destroy a man. It only exposes what was already lost inside him. Maybe he'd rebuild himself. Maybe he wouldn't. That part of the story no longer belonged to me. What did belong to me was peace, hard-earned, quiet, real. I no longer needed an audience, a courtroom, or applause. Just the gentle weight of justice resting on my shoulders and the knowledge that I had turned pain into power without raising my voice. I lived simply, ate well, and laughed more often than I cried. And when I looked out at the sunset stretching across the horizon, I knew. I hadn't just reclaimed my company. I'd reclaimed myself. Now, as the years fold softly behind me, I find myself thinking less about revenge and more about the quiet lessons hidden inside pain. Age gives you a strange kind of clarity, the kind that sees beyond anger, beyond victory. I often sit by the window with my cup of tea, watching the light move slowly across the floor, and I realize how much of life I spent trying to be understood by those who never really listened. My son wasn't my failure. He was my reminder. A reminder that love without gratitude turns to greed, and trust without limits turns to chains. People often ask me if I ever forgave him. The truth is, forgiveness isn't something you hand out. It's something that grows on its own when the noise stops. I didn't forgive him with words. I forgave him with peace. I stopped wishing he'd change and started being thankful that I did. I found joy in my own survival, not his downfall. Sometimes, late at night, I look at that newspaper article framed on my wall. The headline doesn't make me proud. It makes me thoughtful. Because that story isn't really about revenge. It's about resurrection. A man once betrayed, once humiliated, standing again without needing legs to do it. I didn't rise through power or wealth. I rose because I refused to let cruelty define my ending. The company, the headlines, the money, all of it will fade one day. But what will remain is the truth I carried. That dignity, once lost, can be rebuilt quietly by those who dare to wait. I learned that silence isn't weakness. It's the space where justice gathers its strength. I smile now when I think of my son, not with love or hate, but with distance, the healthy kind. Maybe somewhere out there, he's learned what I had to teach him the hardest way possible. Maybe he hasn't. Either way, the lesson was never for him alone. It was for anyone who believes the old are powerless, the broken are finished, or the quiet are defeated. I lived long enough to prove them wrong. Final thought. He sold my wheelchair thinking I'd never move again, but I rolled back into his world not for revenge, for closure. Because sometimes the best way to show strength is to arrive when they least expect you, calm, alive, and holding the deed.